Okay, good morning. My name is Tim Bewes. I'm a professor of English here at Brown, and it gives me great pleasure as one of the organizers of today's event to welcome you to Brown, and especially, of course, to our distinguished speakers. This has been an event long in the making, and you are our dream lineup. So we're very grateful to you for making the effort to come, to prepare presentations that we know will shift and open our thinking, and we really can't wait for the talks and conversations to follow today and tomorrow. So I'm going to open proceedings by offering a really short account of some of the, shortish account of some of the thinking behind it. Why me, first person writing in the age of fictionalized fact, is the culmination of a year-long conversation among four faculty colleagues here at Brown: David Wills, Michelle Clayton, and Kevin Quashie, besides myself. The topics of that ongoing conversation include the growth of interest in first-person narration in so-called literary writing, the question this development raises for what might be called the subjective turn in contemporary culture, and then also associated questions having to do with various challenges to the status of facts and facticity in social and political discourse. I said this event is a culmination, but we hope that it is also the first in a series of events and projects exploring the implications of current cultural practices insofar as they cohere around a kind of preoccupation with the first person in many different forms. So attendees will notice the absence of a certain A word or two possible A words from our title. This is deliberate, although certainly not because we want to make that term or those terms taboo during these 2 days. Nevertheless, the term autofiction, a contraction of the evidently more straightforward, less baggage-laden term autobiographical fiction, has proven to be both hospitable to theorization, excuse me, but also resistant to it. Ever since the publication in 1719 of The Life and Strange Surprising Adventures of Robinson Crusoe Mariner, written by himself, there has been no way to securely or unambiguously fasten any particular use of the pronoun I to the person who authors it, whether that person is named Joseph Conrad, Karl Ove Knausgård, or Maggie Nelson. To identify principles that differentiate autofiction from other kinds of first-person writing is difficult, for autofiction has no distinctive formal features other than of being, as Frederick Jameson laconically put it in a review of volume 6 of Knausgård's My Struggle, somewhat autobiographical. Thus, if we are to circumscribe a field of autofictional studies, we will be better proceeding not with literary works, perhaps, but critical theses, explanations or arguments that might warrant such a terminological innovation and a corresponding change in critical procedures. A number of such theses have emerged in recent years, and I'll just kind of run through 4 of them quite briefly. First of all, the hypothesis that writers such as Knausgård, W.G. Seybold, Rachel Cusk are responding to, quote, a new craving for reality in literature, a new demand for emotional identification, and for an immersion in the world proposed by a novel, unquote. Thus, for Toril Moi, the source of this quote, the appeal of Knausgård's My Struggle has nothing to do with formal innovations. On formalist criteria, Knausgård disappoints. Rather, Knausgård's work signals the arrival of new, contemporary, but also traditional terms on which to evaluate literature, and I'm quoting Moi again: authenticity, passion, and integrity, the quality of descriptions, the capacity to convey reality. End of quote. Knausgård's practice, for Moi, constitutes a rebuttal of 20th century literary theories that put the centrality of the figure of the author or the reliability of emotional investments in literature into question. By contrast, the second example, we might turn to a remark made recently by the critic Carla Freccero that was made in the Q&A of a panel on, quote, auto-theoretical grammar. That was the title of the panel, which was organized by Robin Wiegman at the MLA conference in January 2020. I was present in the audience. Freccero's answer to a question about developments in feminist theory described a very different relation between formal narration and the work's content to the one that I just described in Toromoy. This is what Fracera said. It used to be an imperative within feminist writing to remove as much figuration as possible with a commitment to exactness. What's different in auto-theoretical practice is to allow figuration to be unconstrained. This is a different ethics and a different praxis of writing. So, in other words, autofictional or auto-theoretical practice, far from being predicated on authenticity and integrity, introduces an order of fictionality into theoretical discourse, a degree of figuration, unconstrained figuration, that impacts directly upon the substance of the writing in question. Between these two extremes, we find a number of other substantive positions. In an article entitled Autofiction Infiltrated, Annabelle Kim positions an extraordinary novella from 2002, Pas un jour, Not One Day, by Anne Garretta, narrated in the first person, as a critique of autofictional practice from within. A Trojan horse, on the grounds of the work's, quote, hostility to the premises of the genre, unquote. Those rejected premises for Garretta and for Tim, actually, for Tim as well, actually. For those rejected premises for Garretta and for Kim include an attachment to the object, the inconscient and desire. Meanwhile, for the critic Sarah Bruyette, writing about Sally Rooney, autofiction is nothing but a market form, a generational archetype that operates primarily in the interests of publishers, both ideologically and commercially, in order to, quote, intensify and personalize the novel as therapy, unquote. In the aforementioned review of Knausgård's My Struggle, this is the last example, in the LRB, London Review of Books, Frederick Jameson puts forward at least 3 separate theses, each one of which treats Knausgård's work as a novel. Jameson never uses the A word. The most interesting of these theses involves the question of the diegetical scene of Knausgård's work, which is not one of action, not introspection, not reading, but, as in Proust, writing. Knausgård, says Jameson, brings us readers closer to the protagonist than in any ordinary novel or autobiographically, or than in any ordinary novel or autobiography. Unprecedentedly close, such that the narrative forms of Knausgård's work are no longer vehicular at all. The diegetical loop created by the relation between narrating and narrated event is drawn so tightly that the two coincide. The action of the work is constituted not by the actions of the protagonist or his family, however quotidian, nor by the author's conversations and opinions, but by what happens in between these things, as Jameson puts it, the writing of the sentences. So we have, therefore, 4 or 5 hypotheses. A new craving for reality in literature and a new demand for emotional identification and immersion in the world. A different ethics and praxis of writing, predicated upon a maximal acceptance of figuration, is the second. The novelist's therapy. Fourthly, a new ideology of the subject, one that may be subverted from within the work. And then fifthly, an unprecedented closeness to the protagonist, secured on the basis of a practice that draws the reader into the process of the writing itself. Now, I mean, this is really just a smattering of critical hypotheses. It will barely, of course, we hope, scratch the surface of the conversations we hope to have during this conference. I mention them really just to emphasize the point of departure of this sort of collective project, which is that terms such as autofiction and autotheory only can retain coherence if they are understood as practices in the plural rather than generic formations that must adhere together, ready to accommodate this or that generalizing theoretical explanation. For facilitating this conversation, we are inordinately grateful for the award of a Pembroke Centre Interdisciplinary faculty seed grant from Brown's Pembroke Centre in 2023, which kickstarted the project. The grant was awarded to support, as we phrased it in our application, a colloquium to examine the intellectual and epistemological impact of a reliance on first-person narration that operates on the shifting sands of both subject formation and objective reality. This, by the way, is the event that you find yourself in right now. We are grateful also to the Kogut Institute for the Humanities, not only for hosting this conference, but for supporting us with the Humanities Initiative Programming Fund. This event would not be possible without these crucial forms of support. Thanks also to the to various departments at Brown University that have expressed invaluable support: the Department of English, the Department of French and Francophone Studies, Hispanic Studies, Comparative Literature, Theatre Arts and Performance Studies, as well as the Charles K. Culver Lectureships and Publication. Thanks finally to the Kogut staff, especially Ben Safran, Gregory Kimbrell, Rachel Alm, as well as Damien Maillet and the Kogut's director, Amanda Anderson. And now I'm happy to hand this microphone over to my colleague, David Wills, Professor of French and Francophone Studies, who will say a few words about the other dimension, the other crucial dimension of this event. So thanks, David.
Thank you, Tim. When Tim and I started to think about hosting a conference on autofiction and auto theory and discussed the idea with partners, friends, and colleagues, one of whom gave us our title. So a shout out here to Thangam Ravindranathan, her spirited inventivity. Thank you, Thangam. So when Tim and I started thinking about the event, it became clear rather rapidly that we needed to examine two questions. The first question concerned the contemporary predominance of first-person writing and the fact that it is sometimes practiced with the attendant presumption of what could be called emancipatory authenticity. The second question asked whether there were any convergences to be found between this emancipatory authenticity of the speaking I and an explosion occurring around 2016, the fallout from which produced an incandescent, still smoldering fact death, what might be called the right to alternative facts, my own truth. So we had two juxtaposed phenomena. On the one hand, authors following and diversifying a highly resourceful tradition within which they might write such things as, to quote one of them, "My name is Chloé Delorme. I am a fictional character, un personnage de fiction." On the other hand, a White House press secretary angrily insisting that, although no one had numbers, Trump had attracted the largest audience ever to witness an inauguration, statements that were subsequently famously defended by Trump counselor Kellyanne Conway as alternative facts, given because when the press calls them falsehoods, then she asserts, quote, we feel compelled to go out and clear the air and put alternative facts out there, end of quote. Now, a juxtaposition does not an overlap make. There are myriad ways to distinguish these two phenomena, and the first has produced a fullness of splendidly creative texts, something that we hope will be underscored in the discussion of the next 2 days. But it is clear that, in the last few years, political discourse in at least one so-called liberal democracy has been haunted by the right to one's own facts, proliferating beyond Conway's compulsion to clear the air, indeed morphing into the right to say whatever advances my own cause, irrespective of whether it be true or false. This is not a new practice, of course. It is no doubt as old as politics, but it currently functions in a reconfigured public space. A quick example. On an episode of This American Life, one can hear about former Baptist preacher Mark Harris, who thought he had been elected to Congress in North Carolina in 2018 with a slim majority, then admitted to election fraud after being denounced by his son. Harris himself repented and called for a new election in which he didn't stand. But on Super Tuesday last month, 6 years later, Harris won the primary to run again in November 2024, having found solace in the idea that, and I quote, "Just like the DOJ has come after Trump, the weaponized Democratic-controlled state board of elections came after me. They made up accusations, spread lies. In the end, they succeeded. They stole the election," end of quote. As Joey Chase comments in the episode, quote, "Mark Harris is reading the room correctly. This is the new reality we all live in," end of quote. The This American Life episode is entitled Unprepared for What Has Already Happened. What has already happened includes various things. Podcast journalism, to begin, social media platforms like TikTok or X, and then, of course, artificial intelligence. A whole series of media, therefore, through which information circulates and will henceforth never stop circulating in ways for which we are in no way prepared. I don't expect this conference to make us so much better prepared to handle that new informational scene, but in order to explore differently the convergence between auto-writing, eyes writing that haven't written before, in ways they haven't written before, transforming themselves as they write, between those eyes and other eyes saying whatever comes into their head, in order to look into that a little bit more, I'd like to go back very briefly to another candidate for another office in another time, a little over 400 years ago. "Authors," he wrote, actors, taught not to let any embarrassment show on their faces, put on a mask. I will do the same. So far, I have been a spectator in this theater, which is the world, but now I am about to mount the stage, and I come forward masked. Descartes' famous lavatos prodeo, I go forward masked, a notebook entry is from 1619. He is an ego lavatos, a masked ego or autos, some 18 years before becoming an ego cogitans, a thinking autos. We all know the extent of his victory once he was able to mount the stage with thinking as his mask and pass it off as his real being, cogito ergo sum. We have been living, in the West at least, under that particular regime of emancipatory authenticity ever since. If you like, we have been taking that masked reality for reality itself because he was able to convince us that it was natural, perhaps even eternal. For better or for worse, we have all been wearing Descartes' mask of thinking on our bodies, on ourselves, adjusting it, scratching, even lacerating ourselves underneath it, finding it to be a damned inconvenience, but impossible to discard ever since. And it's not as if he was simply wrong. Yet something does make his Latin syntax hesitate. I'm of course talking nonsense because Descartes didn't really control his Latin syntax any more than any of us controls their language. And besides, I'm betraying that syntax by my transliteration here. But to read it transliterally, the hesitation is there. Sic ego at the beginning of the sentence, and then comes the explanation that up until now he's been a spectator, but he's about to mount the stage and become a contender. Sic ego lavatus prodeo. So I simply want to ask, what comes first? The ego or the masked ego? You can say it is the ego, explicitly and literally. You can say that the ego, sic ego, the autos, comes first. It's there in black and white. But I'd respond in turn that such an ego is a strangely impotent one, an immobile ego, an ego without agency, an ego held in suspense of doing nothing, at least lacking a finite verb that would make it do something. It is only once it is put on the mask, once the ego has become an ego lavatus, once the I is first masked, that it can go forth, act on the stage of the world, do anything at all. Why go back to Descartes? Because you well know Descartes' regime of thinking was inseparable from what we understand as the scientific method. Advance a theory, follow up with empirical observation and systematic experimentation that proposes and rejects untenable counterexamples. That method, combined with a mechanicist understanding of the human body, of the thermodynamic and geometrically certain workings of the universe, and of causation more generally, these were the elements of his system. It was thanks to those parts of Descartes' thinking, not to it or them alone, of course, that we have the deduction of truth and fact by means of analysis and synthesis. And so, by extension, the principle of falsifiability. Hence, scientific fact on one side and a masked I going forth on the other. That was then. But what if now it's different? What if 400 years later we were witnessing a realignment of that model of thinking and the experiential I? A disjoining of one in relation to the other. What if the right to my own facts on one side and retrenchment in emancipatory authenticity, my own experience on the other, what if those were signs of that system in stress? We could be moving on. That could be the case. We could hand over fact-checking in the broadest sense to artificial intelligence and employ our thinking otherwise. Conversely, we could abandon narrative fiction, leave it to Netflix. I don't know. But the hypothesis that I would put forward to end in this forum is this, in this why me understood as first-person writing in the age of fictionalized fact, and a hypothesis still inspired by Descartes as both mask and ego, never one without the other, is that whatever future form the relation, what Meillassoux would call the correlation between the self-authorized, authentic author and the fact and facts of the world, whatever future form that relation take, it will nevertheless still be some version of the masked ego, what I might call the prosthetic ego, something that the I, before it became an I, picked up and put on to venture forth, not just to hide the embarrassment of a blushing or naked I, because even the nakedness of the I was a human contrivance, not something a regular animal I would recognize. No, rather because before any so-called correlation or correlation, there would be the imaginary relation to prosthetic alterity, an artificial, inanimate face fixed to the presumed authentic egological face. Not something put on by a self-conscious and self-constituted I, but a paper or wood or steel mask embedded in the flesh itself. In the question, why me then, I hope we will also hear which me, of course. But beyond that, what me? What substance me? And even beyond that, what matter me? So, welcome to all of you, and welcome to that and those questions.